The newsprint, thin and unforgiving, felt like shedding skin beneath Daniel's trembling fingers. It threatened to disintegrate, much like the composure he struggled to maintain. Tyler's face beamed from the obituary photograph, younger, full of that reckless charm that had once been magnetic, now grotesque in its permanence. A ghost leaping from the ink, dragging with it the suffocating weight of a past Daniel had painstakingly walled off, brick by painstaking brick. Best friend, confidant, betrayer. The man whose marriage Daniel believed he alone had fractured, detonating a carefully planted truth 5 long years ago. But that wasn't the only tremor shaking his enforced solitude today. Delivered an hour before by a blank-faced courier was not just the newspaper, but a small, heavy envelope. Inside, Tyler's unmistakable cursive screamed from a yellowed note wrapped around an old, tarnished brass key. The past isn't buried, Danny. It just waits for the right key. Under the loose floorboard, third from the window, you'll know which room. A cold dread, sharp and specific, snaked up his spine, tightening his scalp. What past? What room? The key felt unnaturally heavy, humming with latent energy. Tyler, always the master of dramatic ambiguity, even in death, the cryptic message collided violently with the shock of the obituary, transforming numb disbelief into a visceral, churning anxiety. His quiet apartment, usually a sanctuary of meticulous order, suddenly felt porous. Vulnerable to the invasive echoes, Tyler seemed determined to orchestrate from beyond the grave. He folded the paper with deliberate precision, the crease sharp final. A stark contrast to the chaotic uncertainty now raging within him. This wasn't just an end. Tyler's posthumous puppetry felt terrifyingly like a summons. The funeral unfolded beneath a sky the color of weeping slate, unleashing a relentless melancholic drizzle. Umbrellas clustered like black mushrooms on the sodden grass, sheltering faces blurred by rain and sorrow. Daniel stood apart, instinctively seeking the grounding presence of an ancient oak near the cemetery perimeter, its rough bark a cool anchor against his palm. He scanned the mourners, familiar faces now strangely distorted by time's passage, and the shared mask of grief names hovering like half-forgotten tunes. Mrs. Gable from next door, her stoicism finally cracked. Mark Jennings, Tyler's former business partner, looking shiftier than grieving. Why exactly had he come? Guilt gnawed a familiar companion. Morbid curiosity pulsed beneath it. But Tyler's note, the heavy key in his pocket, they were the real compels, insistent and menacing. Perhaps it was simply the grim necessity of witnessing the final, undeniable closing of a door he'd only pretended was sealed. Then he saw her moving through the cluster of mourners, like a ship navigating troubled waters. Melissa, Tyler's widow. The woman whose life he had with righteous intent thrown into chaos. Grief hadn't diminished her. It had honed her, stripping away softness to reveal an unexpected, austere elegance. Her quiet dignity, as she accepted condolences, felt profound, practiced almost unnervingly controlled. It wasn't the raw desolation he might have pictured. Where was the shattered remnant of the woman whose illusions he believed he'd shattered? A disquieting thought surfaced. Perhaps the foundation had already been crumbling, long before he arrived with his hammer blow of truth. As the sparse crowd began its slow dispersal, umbrellas folding like retracting wings, her gaze lifted. It swept the damp lawn, methodical searching, and then it found him locked onto him. The intervening 5 years compressed into the frantic space between heartbeats. The ambient sounds, shuffling feet, hushed goodbyes, the drip of water from the oak leaves receded into a dull, roaring vacuum. Her eyes clear and piercingly direct, beneath the damp tendrils of her dark hair, held none of the scorching anger or bitter accusation he'd spent years bracing for. Just a fathomless sorrow, deep and ancient-looking, unnervingly intertwined with recognition, a direct, unwavering acknowledgement that transcended the rain, the grief, the long suffocating silence, and the conventional script of betrayal. She took a measured step towards him, then another, her black coat, a stark slash against the weeping emerald grass. The distance shrank the air between them, thickening, charged with unspoken histories and unanswered questions. She stopped just a few feet away, close enough for him to see the rainwater clinging like tiny diamonds to her eyelashes. Her voice, when it came, was a low murmur, nearly swallowed by the sighing wind, yet it cut through the years with chilling clarity. He said, "You'd know what to do. I'll be waiting for you tonight." 9 words this time, still ambiguous, yet layered with terrifying implication, hinting at shared knowledge, a shared burden. It landed not like a stone, but like a depth charge in the carefully curated stillness of his life, radiating shock waves he knew would irrevocably alter the landscape. Without waiting for, or perhaps expecting a reply, she turned with that same contained composure and walked back towards the waiting car, leaving Daniel standing beneath the mournful oak. Tyler's heavy key seeming to burn a hole in his pocket, the chill seeping into his bones far colder than the rain. Dusk bled into a bruised purple evening. Daniel found himself parked 3 houses down from hers, engine silent. The dashboard clock radiating an impassive, luminous green. 8:17 p.m. The house looked achingly familiar, settled under the sodium glow of the streetlight's windows, downstairs, casting warm rectangular invitations onto the glistening rain-slicked pavement. What else could he do? Her words, coupled with Tyler's note, formed an irresistible, if menacing summons. He said you'd know what to do. Did Tyler anticipate his own death? Did he leave instructions beyond the cryptic note? Was Melissa party to this? The possibilities swirled noxious and disorienting. Recriminations, a final venomous purging, or something far more tangled, something rooted in the secret Tyler hinted at under the floorboards. He finally switched off the ignition, the silence amplifying the thrumming in his ears. The click of the car door sounded like a betrayal in the damp suburban quiet. As if anticipating his exact timing, the porch light flickered on the moment his foot hit the walkway. She opened the door before his knuckles could graze the wood, framed in the sudden pool of warm light. She'd changed out of the severe black, now wearing simple dark trousers, and a soft, dove-gray sweater, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders. The funereal mask was gone, replaced by a visible vulnerability, yet underscored by a steely resolve in her eyes. There were no hollow smiles, no fumbled pleasantries. She simply stepped aside, a silent, loaded invitation into the stillness within. The air inside was thick, unnaturally quiet, carrying the funereal scent of lilies overlaid with something older. Dust polish, the faint, papery ghost of held secrets. It wasn't a house holding its breath. It felt like a house consciously guarding its silence. He followed her into the living room, the geography of it intimately familiar, yet alienating tidy. To the point of sterility, it felt less lived in, more curated, like a stage meticulously set for a play, whose actors had long since departed, leaving only echoes and shadows. No television flickered, no music whispered, only The ponderous, relentless tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hallway broke the silence, each swing of its pendulum measuring out the heavy weight of the moment. She didn't offer a drink, didn't engage in the awkward dance of condolence or superficial small talk. She sank onto the sofa, gesturing with a subtle nod towards the armchair opposite. He sat the worn velvet cool beneath his hand, a tactile memory from other tenser visits years ago, when the air had also been thick with unspoken things, but of a different, more personal nature. They sat suspended in the silence for what felt like an eternity, marked only by the clock's steady judicial beat and the sound of their own breathing, suddenly loud in the confined space. It wasn't entirely uncomfortable, this silence. It was significant, resonant, acknowledging the vast chasm of years, grief, betrayal, and now shared ominous mystery that lay between them. Finally, she turned her head, her gaze direct, unwavering, and unnervingly perceptive. "He told me, you know," she said, her voice, a low, steady thing, devoid of inflection, almost conversational, if not for the charged context, "about the affair, the one you discovered." Daniel braced himself. Here it came. "But not then," she continued, shattering his expectation. "Not when you brought your evidence." A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. No, much, much later. Almost a year ago, drowning in bourbon, after another spectacular argument about something utterly insignificant. Money. Probably his carefully constructed facade just crumbled. The confession spilled out pathetic and self-serving. A cold, tight knot Daniel hadn't fully acknowledged in his gut began to slowly, painfully unravel, replaced by a hollow ache of disbelief. He had carried the crushing weight of being the harbinger, the righteous destroyer of illusions for 5 exhausting years. He'd pictured her, shock her denial, morphing into agony as his words, his proof sank in. He'd cast himself as the unwilling catalyst, the necessary evil. "He told you." Daniel echoed the words, feeling thick, clumsy in his mouth. "A year ago." That specific incident, yes. She clarified, a faint, weary smile, devoid of warmth, touching her lips. He framed it as a moment of madness, regretted ever since naturally. She paused, her forefinger absently tracing the floral pattern woven into the cushion beside her. "But the truth is, Daniel," her eyes snapped back to his sharp, penetrating, "I already knew, long before you came knocking. Maybe not the sordid details, the who, the when, the where, but I knew. I felt the void where intimacy should have been. The meticulously crafted alibis that frayed at the edges, the emotional distance that grew into a glacier." She leaned forward slightly, intensity gathering in her features. "You didn't tell me anything I hadn't already pieced together in the lonely, sleepless hours. Your revelation wasn't a bomb. It was just redundant confirmation, a loud, messy echo of what my own intuition had been screaming for years." He stared at her, the narrative he'd constructed for 5 years dissolving like smoke. His guilt felt suddenly misplaced, even slightly foolish. "Then, why?" The question tore itself from him raw and unvarnished, driven by years of compounded confusion and misplaced responsibility. "Why stay? Why let me believe?" Melissa averted her gaze, turning towards the dark window pane where their reflections floated like pale ghosts against the night. Because the illusion, however fragile, felt safer than the terrifying reality. She whispered the words, laced with a profound corrosive exhaustion. Because dismantling a life, a partnership, admitting to yourself and the world that you chose wrong, that you willfully ignored the sirens. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, too high, too far to jump. Her gaze returned to him raw, now stripped of composure. So you patch the cracks, you shore up the crumbling facade. You pretend the foundation is solid, even as you feel the tremors beneath your feet. It's easier than admitting demolition is the only answer. She drew a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to wrench itself from her core. It was easier until the pretending became a black hole, hollowing everything out from the inside. Her voice dropped again, becoming almost conspiratorial. And my grief, now it's complex, Daniel. It's for the man I thought I married. Yes, but it's deeper than that. It's for the wasted years. The years I actively chose blindness over sight. The years lost to propping up a lie. She leaned forward again, her eyes locking with his urgent now. And Tyler, he had other lies. Bigger ones. Dangerous ones. Lies tangled up with people who don't forgive debts. That note he sent you. That key. They're part of it. He was terrified. Daniel. Utterly terrified. The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably, the air growing colder, thicker. This wasn't just about marital infidelity anymore. Tyler's note, the specific instruction about the floorboard. Melissa's quiet fear, it pointed towards something darker, more threatening. What kind of lies? Melissa? Daniel asked, his voice dropping to a hushed tone mirroring hers. The clock ticked louder now, each second dripping with suspense. Money! She said the word hanging heavily between them. Lots of it, owed to the wrong people, desperate measures, shady deals. He got involved with Marcus Thorne. Daniel felt a chill, despite the stuffy room. Thorne's reputation for ruthless business practices bordering on illegal was notorious. I overheard phone calls, saw encrypted emails he thought I wouldn't notice. He became secretive, paranoid, starting locking his study. That floorboard, he fixed it himself. Weeks ago, said it was warped, but he spent hours in there. Her hands clenched in her lap. I think he hid something. Proof of Thorne's illegal activities, maybe leverage, or perhaps evidence implicating someone else if Thorne decided to silence him. She looked directly at him, fear stark in her eyes. His accident, the police said faulty brakes, wet road. But I don't believe it was an accident, Daniel. I think Thorne arranged it. And I think whatever is under that floorboard is why. The grief in the room was suddenly eclipsed by palpable danger. He wasn't here for absolution or even tentative reconnection. He was being deliberately pulled into the lethal vortex of Tyler's final desperate act. Tyler hadn't just trusted Daniel's meticulous nature. He'd seemingly designated him, his posthumous investigator, perhaps his avenger, the key. Daniel stated, holding her gaze, "Why send it to me? He gave it to me about 2 weeks before he died." She confessed, her voice barely a whisper. He looked haunted, said, "If anything happens, Mel, anything, you decide who gets this. Someone methodical. Someone Thorne wouldn't suspect immediately." He mentioned your name, said, despite everything, you were precise, honorable in your own infuriating way. Her expression was a painful mix of residual bitterness and desperate appeal. He made a catastrophic mess, Daniel, and I think the fallout is right here in this house under our feet. He dragged you back into this. The earlier lighter conversation about their separate lives vanished. Hours melted away, consumed by this new grim reality. Melissa shared, fragmented details, veiled threats. Tyler had muttered burner phones. She'd found unexplained bruises. He'd dismissed Daniel. The clockmaker, accustomed to patient restoration, felt an unwanted but undeniable compulsion to understand the complex, broken mechanism of Tyler's downfall, to expose the hidden gears of deceit and danger. The grandfather clock chimed one, then two, each resonant gong, deepening the sense of impending consequence. Finally, the weight of unspoken action became too heavy. All right, Daniel said, the decision settling within him, heavy but clear. He pushed himself out of the armchair. Show me the room. Show me the floorboard. Melissa nodded silently, relief, warring with fear on her face. She led him down the hall, the ticking clock seeming to follow them towards Tyler's study. The room was oppressively masculine, steeped in the lingering scent of old leather stale cigars and palpable anxiety. It felt like a sealed capsule of Tyler's final frantic months. Melissa pointed towards the heavy mahogany desk. Third board from the window, she murmured, her voice tight. Daniel knelt, running his fingers over the polished oak. He found it almost immediately. One board slightly raised the edges, showing faint signs of being recently disturbed. Using a sturdy multi-tool from the emergency kit he always kept in his jacket, he carefully, quietly worked the thin blade into the seam, easing the board upward. It resisted, then gave way with a soft groan. Beneath, nestled in the dark cavity, wasn't a trove of cash or jewels, but a compact fire-resistant lockbox. It looked serious, official. Daniel's pulse hammered against his ribs. Melissa knelt beside him, holding her breath. The brass key Tyler had sent him slid into the lock. It turned with a quiet, decisive click. Daniel lifted the heavy lid. Inside, meticulously organized, were several thick financial ledgers filled with coded entries, bundles of offshore bank statements, contracts bearing Thorne Development letterhead alongside shell company names, and glinting under the desk lamp, a small, sleek USB drive. Tucked beneath the drive was a single, slightly creased photograph, a much younger Tyler, grinning, shaking hands with a sharp-suited, predatory-looking Marcus Thorne at some long-forgotten corporate event. The camaraderie in the photo felt chillingly false. As Daniel's fingers closed around the cool metal of the USB drive, a sharp scraping sound echoed from downstairs near the back of the house. Both froze, eyes locking in shared alarm. Silence, then unmistakable and terrifyingly close. The distinct splintering crack of the kitchen door being forced open, Melissa let out a choked gasp, her worst fears materializing right before them. Tyler's secrets hadn't died with him. Thorne or his people knew. They hadn't waited long. Quickly! Daniel hissed, adrenaline surging. He shoved the USB drive deep into his own pocket, slammed the ledgers and papers back into the box, snapped it shut, and fumbled to replace the floorboard, praying it looked undisturbed in dim light. Heavy, purposeful footsteps were already pounding across the kitchen floor, heading towards the hallway, towards the study. There was no escape route, no time to flee. Behind the desk, stay down, he commanded, pulling Melissa with him, crouching low in the deep knee hole, just as the study door crashed open violently against the wall. A burly figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the faint hall light. A low-pulled baseball cap shadowed his face, but the focused menace was palpable. He swept a powerful flashlight beam around the room, the light catching dust motes dancing in the sudden draft. He clearly hadn't expected resistance. Well, well. The man rasped his voice like grinding gravel. Looks like Tyler had visitors. His gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on the large desk, then snagging on the floor near the window. Even in the dim light, the slightly misaligned floorboard was visible to a searching eye. His attention snapped back to the desk, the flashlight beam pinning Daniel and Melissa where they huddled. He took a slow, deliberate step into the room. "Thorne sends his regards. Tyler owed him more than money. Thought he could hide Thorne's dirty laundry, did he? Give me the box and whatever else you found." His free hand gestured vaguely menacingly towards his jacket pocket. Daniel's mind worked furiously, calculating angles, assessing risks. The intruder was large, confident, likely armed direct confrontation was unthinkable. His eyes darted around. The heavy desk offered minimal cover. The bookshelves were too far. The window led to a dark yard. Then his gaze fell on the grandfather clock, standing sentinel in the corner, the one he himself had meticulously restored years ago for Tyler. Its sheer weight, its pendulum, its intricate mechanism, precision, timing. An idea desperate and dangerous sparked. "Melissa," he whispered, urgently, barely moving his lips. "The front door. When I make a move, don't hesitate. Run." He didn't wait for her nod. Before the intruder could fully process the whispered exchange or advance further, Daniel exploded sideways, not at the man, but towards the towering clock. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he heaved against its solid frame. The tall clock swayed precariously, its brass pendulum swinging wildly like a scythe, internal weights groaning. Then, with a deafening symphony of splintering wood, protesting springs, and clanging chimes, it crashed forward directly towards the startled intruder. The man yelled a strangled cry of surprise and pain, stumbling back as the heavy clock smashed down, pinning his leg beneath its ornate casing. Glass-shattered gears flew. Chaos erupted, seizing the instant Daniel grabbed Melissa's hand, yanking her from behind the desk now. They scrambled, slipping slightly on the polished floor out of the study, pounding down the hallway. Melissa, her mind surprisingly clear, in the panic fumbled her phone out, mashing 911 as they ran. They burst through the front door into the cool, damp night air, the distant wail of sirens already piercing the suburban quiet. They didn't look back, running hard until they collapsed, breathless and trembling, into the relative safety of Daniel's car down the street. Hours later, cocooned in the sterile quiet of Daniel's apartment, after exhaustive police statements and temporary securing of Melissa's house, the USB drive lay on the coffee table like a dormant viper. The shared terror had irrevocably fused them, burning away layers of resentment, guilt, and misunderstanding, leaving behind a raw, undeniable connection forged in mutual peril. The silence stretched thick with adrenaline's aftermath and unspoken truths. Melissa finally broke it, her voice still shaky but gaining firmness. "There's something else I need to tell you, Daniel. Why I really called you tonight. Why I phrased it like he wanted you involved." She paused, studying her tightly clasped hands. "Tyler didn't confess the affair a year ago out of some drunken remorse." She swallowed hard. "He confessed the day after you came to me 5 years ago. He was frantic, terrified, not just of me leaving him, though that was part of it. He was terrified because the woman involved, the one you discovered him with, it was Marcus Thorne's wife." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. The tangled web suddenly became infinitely more complex, more lethal. He was convinced Thorne knew or would find out. Melissa continued the words, tumbling out now in a torrent of long-suppressed fear. He thought Thorn would destroy him financially, professionally, maybe worse. Telling me, making me the focus of his regret, felt like preemptive damage control, trying to get ahead of the storm he saw coming. She finally lifted her gaze, her eyes glistening with tears, but also with a stark, painful honesty. And Daniel, I let him. I let him believe you were the sole catalyst for my withdrawal, my coldness. It was easier, less terrifying than admitting I already suspected far worse about the money about Thorn for months. It felt safer to deal with a known betrayal than the unknown threat Thorn represented. The final twist wasn't just Tyler's lethal secrets, but Melissa's calculated survival strategy, her subtle manipulation born of sheer terror. She hadn't merely waited for Daniel tonight. She had actively summoned him, leveraging their tangled past, needing his methodical mind, his perceived integrity, perhaps even his capacity for uncovering uncomfortable truths to help her confront a danger she felt utterly powerless against alone. His guilt shifted again, not erased, but recontextualized. He hadn't been the destroyer of a happy marriage. He'd been an unwitting pawn in a much deadlier game, a game Melissa had been forced to play long before his arrival. He wasn't a catalyst. He was a conscripted player in the final act. He reached across the small distance separating them on the sofa, his hand covering hers. Her skin was ice cold, but she didn't pull away. A profound resonant current flowed between them, not of passion, but of shared trauma, stark honesty, and the grim reality of their intertwined fates. "We expose him, Melissa." He said, his voice low but firm, the decision solidifying. "Thorn, we use whatever's on that drive. We finish what Tyler started, or what he was trying to escape." He leaned in, not with desire, but with the weight of their shared ordeal. Their lips met a brief, pressured contact. It wasn't a kiss of budding romance, but of stark acknowledgement, a sealing of a grim pact. It tasted of fear, exhaustion, the metallic tang of adrenaline, and the bitter dregs of long-held secrets finally spilled. It held the weight of 5 years of profound misunderstanding, the ghost of a man far more desperate and compromised than either of them had fully grasped, and the terrifying, fragile potential of a future built not on romantic illusions, but on navigating the treacherous, exposed landscape of truth together. They weren't erasing the past. They were finally irrevocably confronting its dangerous, intricate legacy, shoulder to shoulder, in the harsh, revealing light. Months unfolded, marked by legal proceedings and cautious recovery. The contents of the USB drive, carefully presented by Daniel through an intermediary lawyer, proved devastating. Combined with Melissa's testimony about Tyler's fear and Thorn's veiled threats, it triggered a full-scale investigation into Thorn development. Marcus Thorn's empire crumbled under the weight of fraud, charges, extortion, and conspiracy. Justice, slow and complex, began its grinding process. Tyler's name was inevitably dragged through the mud, his legacy tarnished, but the immediate threat receded. The official cause of his death remained accidental, but the cloud of suspicion surrounding Thorn hung heavy. Daniel's clock-mending tools found a designated space on a workbench in Tyler's former study, now repainted in calming blues, transformed into Melissa's workspace. His books began to colonize empty spaces on her shelves. They hadn't officially discussed moving in. It had simply evolved. He stayed first for safety, then for support, until leaving felt unnatural, unthinkable. Their shared ordeal had forged a bond too deep, too intrinsic to sever. Their cohabitation wasn't a passionate whirlwind, but a quiet settling, a gradual, unspoken merging of two solitary orbits into a shared gravitational pull. Daniel didn't replace Tyler. He occupied a space carved out by truth and shared vulnerability. Melissa wasn't fragile. She was tempered steel, rebuilding her life on a foundation cleared of pretense, choosing a partner who saw her, her strengths, her flaws, her past manipulations. With unflinching clarity, evenings were often quiet, punctuated by the companionable rustle of book pages, the low murmur of conversation over simple meals, the rhythmic tick of the now repaired grandfather clock, a steady heartbeat in the house. Laughter came more easily now, lighter, less burdened. The physical intimacy between them retained the quiet intensity born of their shared crisis. A hand lingering on an arm, a shared glance across the room that spoke volumes, the profound comfort of simply breathing in the same space, knowing the other was truly there. They rarely spoke of a grand future. Their focus remained tethered to the present, to the hard-won peace. Yet sometimes, watching Melissa across the kitchen table, sunlight catching the few silver threads woven into her dark hair as she read the morning paper, Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of unexpected homecoming. Not the fiery, consuming passion he might have once fantasized about, but something deeper, stronger, more enduring, the quiet resilience of earned trust, meticulously rebuilt from the rubble of deceit and danger. It was the profound solace, found not in hiding from the past, but in courageously acknowledging its every shadow, every broken piece, and choosing deliberately to build something true, something honest together, however long and arduous the path had been to arrive. The house no longer guarded secrets. It breathed with them a quiet, steady rhythm of healing acceptance and a complex, enduring love that had waited patiently, not in the wings, but amidst the wreckage finally ready to claim the stage.